Hello, everyone. My name is Shari. I am an author, astrologer, and I specialize in shadow work. Today, the topic is about the moon and what does the moon have to do with shadow work. So, as I said, I'm an astrologer. So, it is important to me, and since I also do shadow work, it was important to me to understand or find the connection between astrology and shadow work. Turns out they go hand in hand. I'd been interested in shadow work at least 5 years prior to studying astrology, but it was by suddenly gaining an interest in astrology that I realized that it was closely linked to shadow work. But that can be said about just about anything in life because astrology is a roadmap of everything, as above, so below. And therefore, the planets in the sky demonstrate or reflect a lot of what we're going through. So they're like a map or a weather, being able to tell the weather, whether or not there's a storm coming or, if it's going to be a sunny day. So they don't necessarily determine how we're affected by transits, but it does reflect what we may come up against in our actual day-to-day lives, and we have free will in how we choose to deal with it. So the planets are just signs, symbols, omens to show us how what's ahead, potential of what's ahead. Doesn't mean that it will necessarily affect or influence you, but there's a potential. And then if should that potential bring some event in your life, ways to express yourself in the highest possibility, or also to prepare you in a way that could make whatever is coming or potentially coming make it a little bit more easier because there's an understanding and a preparation for what's ahead, potentially ahead. As I said, astrology is a very complex science, so it's not something that we can absolutely say for 100% certainty that a certain transit is going to affect you in that absolute way. But it's based on cycles and studying cycles and what may have happened previously when a similar cycle took place can give us clues as to what is potentially possible when those cycles repeat. This has been studied for thousands of years. And unfortunately, astrology has been given the bad rap as fortune telling because a lot of people assume that if you're looking at your natal chart, you are going to somehow see how they're going to be famous or rich or meet the ideal partner. And it may tell you the potentials or the possibility for it during that cycle, but it doesn't determine that for sure, nor is it going to give it to you the way some people assume it will. So if astrology is being understood and studied in the way that it's meant to, we can look at every single planet in our natal chart, and it helps us to understand ourselves in the deepest possible way. Now, the term know thyself is exactly what astrology will allow us to do. It allows us to know ourselves or thyself on a personal level first, because that's the most obvious. That's our ego, that's our personality, that's the self-image, that's the persona. But once we start to, if we're really, ready for deeper work, we'll understand that that's just a superficial layer. And we can go deeper through shadow work inwards and then start to unpack deeper levels in our own chart and in ourselves, and see that beneath or below or inwards, there is a deeper self that exists. And that self is the I am presence. It's also considered the soul. It's also the spiritual ego. And it is also the self before it becomes identified as an ego identity or a self image. Then we start to understand that that's the deepest part of ourselves. Of course, it goes deeper because then there's alignment in the oneness of who we are, which is God, or spirit that is aligned in God. And that's when we're at our purest level of Christ consciousness. But first, we have to start with what we can first see and understand, at least in a more superficial or obvious way. And that is to first understand the outer layer of the personality. And by looking at that, we can start to see that the personality has certain conditions. It's a programmed idea that's living up to expectations. The birth chart will show us how, because each planet has aspects. It's in a certain sign, it's in a certain house, and it's making aspects to other signs in other houses, and some of them are easy aspects, which are trines and sextiles, and some are difficult, well, I shouldn't say difficult, but more challenging aspects, such as squares and oppositions. The other thing is that, a lot of people don't like to hear the negative way of saying things like, darker or negative or lower. But, reality is made up of both darkness and light. There cannot be light if there's no darkness. So when I have to tailor words and say challenging instead of, difficult, then, it waters down the reality of what we're living in, because then we're starting to tiptoe around what feels comfortable to us. When in fact, to know thyself, we have to know what feels uncomfortable to us. We have to acknowledge and then confront the things that are difficult to us. Because in doing that, then we're starting to sit in our fears and allow that fear to teach us in the deepest way about ourselves. This is what shadow work is. And this is why a lot of people are not exactly excited about doing this type of work. However, you reap the deepest rewards, because then you start to understand that your fears are not real. They're not real things. They're things that we're conditioned to believe have this huge effect on us. And the part of us that it affects is the part of us that's an outer layer and that wants to be protected and has certain standards and rules for how it wants to experience reality. And when it gets pushed against, it feels challenged, or it feels threatened, and therefore it raises up fear. And I'm speaking of the ego identity, the shell, the mask. It does not like anything that is uncomfortable. And because of that, we live in this very narrow lane of not wanting to see our darker side, not wanting to see the negative aspects of the self. We only want to see what's in the middle. What we believe will, be positive, and what we believe will be our helpful. What we believe fits our ideas of ourselves, and what we believe will fit into our predetermined expectations. Now, when we do that, we're living a very narrow life, and we're not allowing the broader scope of reality in. And if we're not seeing everything as it is and only seeing things as we need them to be, then this is a very threatening place because, as you can see, reality happens. And we don't have any control over a lot of things. We don't have control over the weather. We don't have control over, whether or not you're going to have an accident sometimes. Because if it's something fated in your chart, then that accident is going to happen. Now, how you choose to deal with the disasters that we're faced with is where your power lies. But if you still only have a narrow scope on how you think things should be, then this leaves us in a very limited and tense and anxious way of living our lives, because rules are overridden all the time and life is unruly. So shadow work allows us to have a broader perspective and to be able to incorporate all sides of ourselves in a way that we can accept our not so positive and pleasant side and see it for what it is. That doesn't mean that we get to use it and against someone else and say, oh, well, this is me, I'm just an angry person. No, then you miss the whole point of shadow work. If you, for example, you confront that you are an angry person or have been an angry person for a long time, and for the first time in your life, you're beginning to accept, or not even accept, but acknowledge that there's anger that exists within you, and you start to do the shadow work to recognize this anger, then what happens is that eventually, if you start to see yourself responding to anger and spewing it out there onto other people constantly, then if you are witnessing yourself as the shadow work intends for you to do, then you'll start to see how you are just throwing your own moods and emotions onto other people. And this is not that easy to see, because maybe you don't want to see yourself as angry. But seeing yourself as this angry person opens the door for you to now become more aware and responsible, and also to accept that there's this part of you that needs to be healed. And the healing comes from the awareness of it and how it's activated in you. It's always triggered by these, simple things. Now, how I got off into anger, I don't know, but let's go to the reason for this this talk, which is about the moon. Now, the moon is our moods, so maybe I came up with anger because of that. But the moon in the natal chart represents many things. And so in astrology, your moon represents the mood you're in. And the reason it's your mood is because it's your emotional body. It's how you experience your emotions. It's how you filter your emotions. So it's how you represent yourself through the filters of your emotions. So the moon also is the part of you that wants to feel safe and protected and secure. The moon is also the part of you that wants to feel comfortable. It wants the comforts. It's who you are in the comfort of your home. It's a side of you that people see only in the privacy of your home, or around family members that you're comfortable with. So this is why it also rules the family. And this is why it also rules the home. It rules nurturing, sustenance. So in order to feel secure and protected, we want to be comforted or feel secure in the idea of a mother comforting us as children. So the moon represents how we are as a child, or even in past lives, how we were nurtured. It also represents mothers. And I don't know if I said this before, but it represents the womb that gives birth. No, I didn't. It's the womb that gives birth to everything. So all of reality comes through the womb, whether it's a literal womb or a symbolic womb. So the moon is the symbolic womb. Women are the literal womb. The the moon also rules women and feminine energy. It is also very intuitive, and it's also very receptive. An interesting thing about the moon is that it has no light of its own. So the light that it receives comes from the sun. And then here on Earth, we are seeing the reflection of the sun onto the moon. So from our perspective, the moonlight that we see is really a filter of the sun. So this is why the moon is considered how we filter our reality. And how we filter our reality is going to be through our emotions. We don't, this reality it exists due to taking some kind of action, but our actions need something to motivate us. And emotions is what motivates us, or our feelings is what motivates us. If if there's no desire to act, then we're likely not to. Now, also speaking of desires, desires come from the five senses: touch, taste, hearing, sight, feeling. I believe I said all five. They're the five primary senses. So reality comes from the desire to experience the five senses through our feelings, through what we feel emotionally invested in. So the moon is a very important part in our chart. And when we understand the moon in our own natal chart and we're doing shadow work, it helps to explain how we experience our reality through what we feel. And what we feel determines a lot of how we're going to behave and the actions we're going to take. And it also shows our motivations. So understanding the moon is essential. The other thing I want to mention is that the moon is ruled by the sign Cancer. And Cancer is a cardinal sign. It's also ruled by water. And the water is connected to our emotions. Now, emotions and water esoterically means the same. And that's because our emotional body is made up of the waters in our body. And the body has over 70% water. Majority of it is blood. Some of it is, to a lesser degree, is cerebrospinal fluid. And then there's also saliva, urine, and seminal fluids in the body. But regardless of that composition, the majority of our body is made up of water. So to say that the moon has no effect on us would be not possible, because if the moon is ruled by water and we are made up of water, it shows how we are influenced by our moon here on Earth. Speaking of that, Earth also has about 70% water. All the water masses put together is about 70%. So what the moon is doing says so much about how we're affected personally and also in the grand scheme of everything in our physical reality here on Earth. The moon phases affect us. When it's a new moon, it's an opportunity to plant new seeds. If you're starting a project, it's a great time to do that, especially when you're looking at your natal chart and if it has a lot of resonance with what's going on in your chart, it can show you the optimal time for this. When to start a business, when to launch a campaign, when to put your marketing through, when to apply for a job. So new moons are essential. But then there's also full moons. And the full moon is when we can reap the benefits of the things that we have sown during the new moon time, whether or not it's to, end a cycle, complete something that we've started, or reap the benefits of the things that we've sown. Then also the moon cycle has eclipses. These eclipses take place anywhere from 4 to 6 times a year. And this is when the moon moves across the sun to the point that it's covered, depending on if it's a total eclipse or not. And these eclipses are so impactful on our lives. And if we're having an eclipse on a very sensitive point in our chart, like our actual sun or a natal moon or an ascendant or another planet, then something in our own lives will get triggered. These eclipses are like time warps. It's almost like some quantum shift can happen, especially if your natal chart is being triggered in directly based on the eclipses that are happening. So this is showing us how intense or how active the moon is in our natal chart. Now, when I speak of the moon, I also have to talk about the sun because it takes both of them to have this eclipse, the sun and the moon. Just like when there is a new moon and a full moon, the sun is active in the picture too. And the sun and the moon, as I believe, I know I have said in previous videos, but depending on whether or not you've seen them, the sun represents our left brain, and the moon represents our right brain. I discussed that in the video speaking about the sun and astrology. So human beings have 2 hemispheres in the brain. We have 3 brains altogether, but the third brain, or the most advanced brain in a human, is the neocortex, and it has a left and a right hemisphere. Now, the lower brain, which is not included in what I'm speaking of, is our animal brain. It's the most instinctive and animalistic side of us. When we are really living in a primitive way, like not being able to control ourselves through anger or sexual tension and, just real primitive and instinctive actions, we're living in the animal brain. Then there's a middle brain, which is the limbic brain, and that's really a very holy place in the body. That's actually where your pineal gland and your pituitary gland exist. It's the cave of Brahma, and it's also considered the Holy of Holies, if you're speaking of something in the Bible, referencing to the Bible. Also now, then there's the neocortex, which is the brain that has the left and right hemisphere. And this is a more advanced brain that humans have access to. So the left brain is ruled by the sun, and it's a masculine energy. It also is the dominant brain because it is very developed, because we use it every day to learn things. We go to school, we educate ourselves, we can get conditioned through rules and patterns that get implanted in the left side of our brain. Left side of our brain rules the right side of our body, which is common for most of us to be dominant with our right side of our body. Now, the right brain, which is the moon, is the feminine qualities. Now, just as reality has overlooked a lot of our feminine qualities, brain is not being as actively used as it should be, because both hemispheres should be balanced. So anyway, the right brain is the intuitive side, it's the feminine side, it's the emotions, which we tend to ignore and disregard or distort or suppress. It's also our creative side, and it rules the left side of the body, which it's common for it to be our less dominant side, unless you're left-handed. Now, when both hemispheres of the brain are synthesized, this is when we get access to the limbic brain, where the pineal gland and the pituitary gland become more activated and work together in opening the central eye or the third eye. But shadow work is fantastic for this if you go deep enough to really understand the self and start to peel back the layers of who we are, and then get access to balancing that right and left hemisphere of the brain, getting in touch with the limbic brain, and also our heart center. But when we understand how to heal our moon, we're really doing shadow work. Because remember now, the moon is the darker side. It's the side of us that it's night, you know. It's not as easy to see because it's our subconscious and our unconscious memories. They are also stored there. So getting access to them, we need to go through our moon sign. Now, the moon sign is, like I said, ruled by water, which is 70% of our our makeup in our physical body. And like I said, it's also an emotional body. But also, since I said that the blood is the majority of the water that we have in our body, fluid-wise, the blood is what has our DNA on a cellular memory, in our cellular memory. And the DNA is what we inherit from our ancestry line. So also the moon means our ancestors. It means our DNA. It also means that we don't have as much free will as we do with the sun, because we inherit a lot of our karma, either from our personal past lives or our ancestry line, or even our collective group that we're born from. These are memories, trauma from war or slavery, or just plain abuse that is unprocessed and unhealed, gets carried through our bloodline and exists in us as wounding, even if it didn't happen in this lifetime. We're likely to recreate experiences in this lifetime based on those woundings so that we can heal them. Not so that we can re-experience them the way that we have and the way that we commonly do, because a lot of times we're not ready or don't know how to access this in us. And shadow work is what gives us access to this part of us, where we start to peel back the layers and get to the deeper side of ourselves, start to understand our unconscious and subconscious wounding. And like I said, even though some of it is linked to your ancestry line way back, you can almost always find a tie somewhere in this lifetime. Even if you don't have the words for it, there'll be an emotional connection somehow. We're not left as helpless souls in this reality. We're always given the key to ourselves. Whether or not we choose to use that key, well, most of us don't, right? Until we're ready. So understanding that the moon is our DNA and it's the cells in our body, and 70% of the body is made up of water, which is our emotions, and that we are carrying this in our on an energetic level makes us have less free will, because this is already a part of us that comes into existence carrying these wounded baggages, which is called karma. We don't like the word karma because we're afraid of it. And or I wouldn't say we, but a lot. I don't like the word karma a lot, or don't use the word karma. And that's just your ego needing to be protected from what it doesn't want to face in itself. But the fact is that if we're carrying energy from a past life, no matter good or bad, it's called karma. And karma is really just action, the action you take. But the action you take always comes from an emotional trigger, an emotional motivation. And the emotional motivation comes from the moon. So the free will I'm saying now that we need to get to is our sun. And in the video I did previously, where I spoke about the sun's free will, is that the sun is where we can get our inner authority and power to claim our own passions and know what our mission and purpose is in this reality as a soul is. But we don't use it because it's overridden by its lower expression of conditioning and following the rules and staying in the expectations of what you are born into. However, the potential for free will exists in the sun sign. So just because the moon sign has less free will does not mean that they can't work together. And this is why the brains, the right brain and left brain, need to work together, synthesize to get access to us being able to find the middle ground between our free will, karma that's stuck. Now, there's a side of us that has no free will. And it's been debated, how much free will do we have? No one has been able to pin it down. That's not even possible, really. But based on astrology, commonly it's said that we have about 25% free will, which we might say that's not enough, not when 75% is not even left up to us. But honestly, if you use your sun sign, you will have access to free will. Now, the way free will works is not that you get this free will and this means that you can make $1 trillion and fly around the world and do what you want. No, free will, and you can do that. That's what free will is used for when it's on the negative side. But when it's used for its highest intention, free will means that you align your personal will in divine will. And then you get guidance from spirit. And then you're living in alignment with your true mission and purpose as a soul. So finding that balance between both comes when we heal our moon sign, our emotions. We start to find more access to the part of us that's wounded and stuck. It starts to free up, dissolve, transform, and even transmute into higher frequencies. And the more elevated we become in our consciousness, because we're no longer carrying the heavy baggages of our, emotional wounding, we'll still carry some, but, it gets lighter. Then the more we are able to align in our sun signs free will, we start to become more open to higher possibilities. And these higher possibilities are what allow us to live in the middle ground. Now, also, the moon is the womb, and the sun is the father. So the father and the womb, which is the mother, when they come together and we find that middle ground, which is the left brain and the right brain also, find that middle ground, they commingle, and then Christ consciousness is possible. So this is where the Son, the SON, is born from the SUN, Son. So the Son, which we call Jesus, who is also Christ consciousness, is then born in us when we do enough work to build our inner temple. Now, the inner temple is a whole psycho-spiritual process that is a physiological alchemy that happens in the body, where the kundalini in the body rises and they meet here in the third eye, where the Christ, which is also the temple, which is also where the limbic brain is, the Holy of Holies. Brahma's cave, it's also the holy matrimony between the mother and the father, which is the right brain and the left brain. When they come together, Christ is born in that third eye. And we start to have access to higher dimensions or higher realities. And we start to see more than we once saw. We also get access to higher knowledge and wisdom that we couldn't have seen before because we were too narrow in our thinking. So we get a broader perspective, a higher perspective. We get access to deeper wisdom. Our intuitive discernment opens up, and we start to see more and more and more of ourselves first, because that's where you get to know thyself. And I may do a video on knowing thyself, even though it will be very similar to this. But this is where we get to know thyself. And the self I'm talking about, like I said, is not, first it starts with the personality. It has to. And if it doesn't, then you're bypassing. And this is common with a lot of spiritual materialism, it's called, where you want to be the spiritual person, but you don't want to work on your own psychology and really start to see the hidden, wounded parts of yourself that is living in the shadow. And this is why a lot of people who are very spiritual will do the opposite of what they're calling spiritual. They'll go around and have extra marital affairs, or, do the most dysfunctional things because they haven't dealt with their shadow. If you don't deal with your shadow, because you have to confront the darker side of yourself, you have to go inwards and face that deep demon inside of you and sit with it and accept and know that this is a part of you that you've come into this reality to experience. Now, by doing that, it is no longer controlling you unconsciously. I'm not saying that we're condoning negative behavior or accepting that we're angry people, or that we are sex addicts, or that we're, some violent person. I'm not saying that. But the fact is that a lot of people who are behaving violently or are sex addicts, it's because they haven't addressed this side of themselves. They haven't gone inwards and sat with that part of them that's perverted and distorted. And because it's denied, it projects itself out there, and it gets used. It has to get used because it's energy, and everything in this reality is energy. And if you want the energy to be used in its highest expression, then we have to be able to acknowledge what we have access to, so that we have some intention or integrity behind how our own personal energy is being used and expressed in our reality. The only way to know that is to know thyself. If we want to deny who we are, whether it's the good, bad, ugly, if we want to deny that, then it will continue to exist in us. And we are just following along, getting hurt and taken further down into the dark side of ourselves, where we will get born again in our next life. And this is reincarnation. If, as an astrologer, I absolutely support the theory of reincarnation. And if you don't, that's fine. Think of your ancestry line. It still comes back either way. You can't deny that you have ancestors. So this also is still all moon I'm talking about. So it will come back, and maybe even worse for the next lifetime. Because the whole idea is that we start to face that shadow in us, heal, turn inwards, and get back to God. And God within. I'm not talking about God, the external God that, churchianity preaches. I am talking about the inner Father who art in heaven, in that inner temple. So I'm not saying, anything wrong with an external God, but until you know your own inner God, you'll give your power away to something that you think is better or higher than you. And the only way to know your higher self is for you to become the higher self, and to know that everything happens within you first. And if it's not happening from the highest version of you as your highest expression, then you're going to express it in a distorted way and give away your power to something that you think is higher or more superior than you. And again, don't twist this. I am not saying that you're superior to everyone else. Everyone has their own inner superiority. And this is just coming from having your own inner authority, not to have authority over another, but have authority over yourself. Be superior in yourself. None of it is to be out there. When you know that in yourself, then you can manage it, or it gets used for its highest good if there is integrity behind everything that you're doing. If you're doing this from a place of being conscious, aware, intentional, and guided by spirit within you, then it will be for the good of everything, including yourself and others, always. So I hope I didn't miss any key points, but this is the moon, and the moon is an extraordinary part of your chart. It wasn't until I got access to the moon in my own chart that I really started to understand how important the moon is in a natal chart. And especially if it's in a difficult position, as it was in mine, semi-difficult, it's harder to get to depending on where it is in your chart. Mine is in Aquarius, which makes it a more emotionally detached moon. And it wasn't until I started to access the emotional side of me, the wounded side of my emotions, that I got access to my moon. And by getting access to my moon, I was able to get access to my sun, which is my inspiration. So by healing my emotions, you feel more inspired, because the heavy karmic baggages that you're carrying, they get dissolved or transformed. And then you're more elevated to live the higher aspirations of your sun sign, which is what you're here for, your purpose. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you'll join me for my next video. Thank you for joining me. I hope you'll subscribe, like, and share. Again, if you're interested in a birth chart reading, I am available. And also, I do shadow work coaching if you're also interested in that. The information is below. Feel free to contact me. Thank you and goodbye.